All right. Good morning, afternoon, evening, night, wherever you may be in the world. Where I am, it's Thursday, February 15th, 2018. And this is the SIG Architecture Community Meeting. I am Jay Singer-Dumars, co-lead, along with Brian Grant. And we are going to kick off the meeting. If you want to follow along after the fact, the agenda is available at bit.ly/sig-architecture. And we will have notes from this meeting there, as well as links to relevant proposals and whatnot if you want to look at those. Today we have a relatively aggressive agenda. So we're going to time box the first discussion at, let's do 20 minutes on that, and 20 minutes on Kube Builder, and 15 on Cron job. So I'm going to be relatively militant about keeping our time boxes in place today. So without further ado, today we have an interesting cross-SIG meeting with SIG PM, and the intent is really to sort out what is currently, I believe, a relatively messy feature process with some confusion about how KEPs relate to that, and how SIG PM's mission has essentially, since it was founded, radically changed. Originally, SIG PM was intended to be program, product, and project, and all those different Ps are now sort of at different odds with one another. So essentially what we want to do is find out what are the places that we overlap with SIG architecture, what are the ways in which SIG PM can serve architecture, and basically try and make sure that we're all in alignment around all the things we're trying to accomplish. Because right now, I feel like the SIG PM is flagging, and we need to do a much better job of serving the community, and I don't believe we're doing that. So I'm going to turn the mic over to Ihor, but ostensibly I'm not a leader in SIG PM, but I'm very active in it, so I will be probably wearing more of the SIG PM hat in this discussion than SIG architecture, so that's my disclaimer. You want to fire it off, Ihor?
Yep, sure. I'm Ihor. I'm a co-lead of SIG PM together with Caleb, who is also there at the meeting. I hope that our partner will join us soon. We should have enough quorum on discussing this item. So first of all, I'd like to mention that the major part where SIG PM was involved during the last around a year. So these days we're celebrating our first anniversary of SIG PM, and the major area where we've been involved during the last year was the features process and the roadmap process. At the same time, I should mention that when we have established SIG PM and when the original features process was established, neither SIG architecture, nor SIG release, nor KEP process hasn't existed at all. So today we have a bit different story of how do we manage Kubernetes at all as a project. And I'd like to receive the complex feedback and suggestions how should we move on with the current state of Kubernetes, especially in the features area, in the enhancements area. How can we work on the new features for Kubernetes together in the scope of KEPs and so on. So Jace has pasted a link in the meeting notes about the proposal of enhancement delivery management in Kubernetes ecosystem. We have prepared this document a few months ago in the scope of SIG PM. As far as I remember, even KEPs haven't existed so in so mature state as they exist today. So I'd like us to briefly review this document and provide some suggestions and provide some feedback on what can we do today to make this process more efficient. The second part is, so as Jace mentioned, how can we, as SIG PM, how can we collaborate with SIG architecture, and what are the areas where do we overlap, and one of us should step back and simply work in the same area where one SIG currently works today, and what are the areas where we don't have an overlap, and we should focus more on this specific area. Also, I'd like to discuss the future of the features repo itself, as as the primary repo that is owned by SIG-PM, the primary place where we've been tracking our feature-related activities for Kubernetes for around 1.5 years. But again, when features repo was established around 1.5 years ago, so much things have changed during this time, and I hope that we may find a better process of managing the features, managing the feature-related process, because from my personal standpoint and my personal feedback on how these things are happening in the features repo during the last 1, 2, or 3 releases, this repo is not so actively used by Kubernetes contributors and by Kubernetes developers. So at the same time, most of them have moved to KEP process and to related processes. At the same time, we can't kill and destroy features repo at all, because it brings the significant value for the areas that are not related to the technical development of Kubernetes itself. It still has the extremely big value for marketing people, for people outside of Kubernetes community who are looking at what's going on with Kubernetes and what's happening within Kubernetes and what we're delivering with the new release of Kubernetes for our customers. And features repo is the final source of truth for them. We have the more user-friendly version of the features repo with the features tracking spreadsheet that I'm maintaining for a couple of releases. But the features repo is still the final source of truth of what do we have exactly in Kubernetes happening. So
I kind of take a little bit of umbrage with that last statement.
Okay.
Because it's not true. People don't keep it up to date. So I think that's a bit of this misnomer, because I often get asked periodically from other locations about the state of things which are ill-maintained in the features repository.
Okay, yeah. So that's yet another reason why do we have this discussion. So I would notice that around 90% of features in the features repo are really up to date and maintained by the actual owners. At the same time, we have around like 10% of features that are not really actively maintained, and we have to push the feature owners to update them correctly.
I would probably say it's something more like 30% are maintained and 70% are mostly out of date.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, this gets into the heart of the issue, is that what actually are the features, or the code is the only thing that really knows. And even the labels and flags are not accurate. We're seeing that this release more than I've seen in others, where there's a fuzzy line between what's an enhancement, a cleanup, a bug fix, and a feature. So we're starting to lose fidelity on this, and that's a real serious problem.
Yep. So I'm open for discussion. So I'd like to receive the community feedback, your feedback on what can we do better and how should we change the current process, because it's a bit struggling these days.
So I actually think that in order to ensure that it's used, it has to actually tie more tightly into development workflow of users. So I much like we have the feature complete date that people need to hit, and they need to ask for exceptions to get changes merged after that date. And we have automation to stop automatically merging PRs and things like that. If it were tied to the actual development process and automation more tightly, then there would be a better chance of using it. So I really still believe we're going to need to stop most development in the master branch of Kubernetes in order to make that happen. Like, once people start merging stuff into the master branch, then it's really hard to impose any kind of requirements or timelines or whatever, because you can't, it's not practical to revert that stuff anymore.
I don't disagree with you, Brian. I think I agree with you entirely. But do you think we can actually do it?
Well, can we take a step back? Because I feel like we're diving right down into solution here. I think the fundamental problem with the features process as it exists is that there are essentially no carrots and no sticks. There's no benefits to actually working through that process, and there's no downsides to ignoring it.
I don't agree with the carrots. I think there's a huge carrot in the sense that if people are proud of what they're delivering in terms of features, that is the avenue to get that exposure in terms of blogs, the release notes, and all that stuff.
Oh, but you can get stuff into the release without features. You can get it into the docs without features. You can get it into the product without feature. You can write blog posts on it without features.
And honestly, I don't think the people who are developing those features are actually motivated by any of those things. Like, as just said, like, I want to blog it, I put it on my own blog, right? I think we should maybe separate this out. Like, I think there's the how do we propose improvements and track improvements question, which is, I think, the features and KEP and all that sort of stuff. And then there's what Brian is saying, which is basically like, we don't have a mechanism. Even if we had these things, I don't think we have a mechanism for enforcing it if everybody's merging code in master. And I totally agree with what you said, which is like, there's just so much room for wiggling that, like, if you're determined, you can merge your feature whenever the hell you want to merge your feature, and there's very little that we can do about it.
Yeah, I agree.
That's true. That is true.
And so I think we should separate out the discussions, and I don't know which one we want to have. One is around the logistics of how do we, discuss and come to agreement on a feature. And then the other is how do we tie the actual development of the feature to a specific release and a specific timeline. They're both very relevant discussions, but we should decide which one we're going to have and have that one out.
So, popping up a level in terms of how this discussion started with overlap between SIG architecture and SIG PM and KEP and features. And KEP, at least my original intent for that was to replace the unspecified cargo cult-based proposal process. And the reason it was in SIG architecture is because that's one of the means by which we have to review significant changes to Kubernetes to ensure that they conform to our conventions and guidelines and requirements and so on. It does have some amount of overlap with the features process in terms of tracking the stage of development and identifying major changes. But I don't think my view is that it shouldn't be 100% overlap necessarily, in that the implementation details were never in the features issues or weren't intended to be there. They're supposed to link out to the proposal or design or whatever. So they seem complementary to me. One thing we could do is, even in the absence, it's related to the feature branches, but one thing that a feature branch would do is create an identifiable place where changes could get merged and a controlled process by which those get folded into a release. Another approach would be that changes would require, instead of a blanket milestone label, we could develop like some more specific mechanism for identifying individual features that have been vetted to go into a release or something like that. So we'd have to categorize like bug fix or cleanup versus features still, but the features would all be individually identifiable, even in the absence of branches. So I
3 minutes left here. I get the feeling that the SIG PM folks were looking for some sort of resolution. Is there a specific sort of proposal, or because we're moving forward with the KEP stuff, and I'd love to, and obviously there's bumps in the road there that I think are worth talking about. There's clarification there that's worth talking about. But is there a larger sort of reset that folks are looking for? Is there a larger set of?
Yeah, I think what we need to do is just write a proposal. What I want to say here, and hopefully this is recorded until the end of time, the KEP process is not ever, and nor will it ever be, a replacement for the features process. It is the proposal process. The features process is a separate process, which is how, at a very low level from the commit level, that you track the work. So I think that if we can at least accomplish that, that helps us delineate where SIG architecture and where SIG PM shake hands. Because right now that's been muddled and it's really causing a lot of injury.
So I got to be honest. I think there's a ton of confusion in terms of what exactly the feature process is and what the granularity there is. And I mean, maybe some clarity there, because I think in your mind, Jace, you have a very clear view of it. I pulled up the original message that kicked off the features repo, and I'm going to post that in here just as a point of history. And I think it's mutated over time. And I think it's worth for us maybe to actually, you know, if you really believe the features process is something that needs to exist separate from KEPs, and I think I'm totally open to that. I think we just need to have some clarity and some guidance for folks. And I don't think it's there right now.
That document that I linked has that, I believe.
Okay.
It's very, very clear. And it is not in any way, there's no ambiguity about it, I hope. If there is, please mark the hell out of it.
This is the document that was linked out of the notes?
Yes.
Okay. Too many documents flying around. Sorry.
No kidding. And I'm sorry, I hate to add another one to the pile, but this is
that's what we do.
Important thing. So I think the other thing is just, I mean, since we're running out of time, let's make sure that we have an open dialogue between the two SIGs. It would be nice to have more architecture representation in SIG PM, just even as guest attendees, so that we can have these discussions.
So one issue I have, it happened to not be the case this week, but one issue I have is that they, in the past, have often collided with CNCF TOC meetings.
Yeah. Right.
Yep. That's a problem. Well, tell you what, let's fix that.
That was a problem. We've changed our cadence of meetings a bit, so our meeting is happening on every second and fourth Tuesday of a month, while CNCF TOC meeting is happening on the first and third. At the same time, we are currently facing some issues with the show up, with the time, and for myself, for Caleb, for our partner, to be present at every meeting. So we're considering the total rescheduling this meeting to a more convenient time. So yeah, it's one of the major issues we have to start with solving it. So
yeah, I think if it were just a half an hour later, get more people from the West Coast, because it collides with a lot of people's commutes.
There's also, I sent an email to SIG PM mailing list, and I think you can look at it without having to join. But it's a really important email about SIG PM's raison d'etre, which is really, what does the P stand for nowadays? Is it program, project, or product? Because each of those things is different. They have different missions. And in some cases, product and project are at odds with one another, because if you're trying to get a feature in and it makes the timeline slip, then you have a conflict between product and project management. So I wrote a long missive about, like, let's just determine what the heck our mission is and how do we accomplish it.
That's on the SIG PM list?
Yes.
Okay. I'll have to find that. I have concerns because I think SIG PM, my impression is that it tries to apply a management model that works inside of a top-down company to an open source project. And I think a lot of the friction here is that there is no one set of people that can direct things. We can provide incentives, and those incentives have to be enforced. And those incentives have to be embedded in terms of the processes and the people that hold power to make things happen. And so, again, it comes down to carrots and sticks. In a big company, the carrot and stick is, you know, promotions, and you get paid and you can get fired, right? That doesn't exist really inside of the project. And so I'm not sure if the traditional way of thinking about this is actually going to be effective.
Well, one thing sorry, I think we're past time, but I do think it's worth follow-up. We do need significant project management help across the project with the scale that we're at. I did intend to come talk to SIG PM about that at some point, but I haven't been able to make the time.
Can we give Brendan the floor for a second?
Yeah.
I'm in total agreement with Joe.
Yeah. And if
okay, we have that on record.
Yeah. My email goes into exactly that thing. So yeah, read it, respond. Let's have that discussion, and let's figure out what we need to do. Moving on. Do we have
Thank
Mr. Whitrock here to discuss Kube Builder? Well, this is going to be a short 20 minutes.
Yeah, he might still be on paternity leave.
Yeah. Okay. Huh. All right. Let's move on to cron job instantiate.
Hi there. Yeah, I'm here. Mate here.
Great.
So here's the thing. There was a request to be able to schedule cron jobs manually ad hoc. And initially, we thought that we are going to introduce another endpoint on a cron job so that every single client could use that endpoint instead of manually creating the job itself. But it appears that there's more problems with this approach than actually the good thing coming out of it. So David Eads proposed that instead of doing this, we would just go with a kubectl command.
Sorry, Maciek, could you describe David Eads' concern with that proposal first?
Sure. So David's concern is that instantiate for a cron job is very simplistic because all it does is just copies over the job template and applies labels and annotation. So there's no problem of like in OpenShift what we have, that the user can do it by himself instead of the need for the system to be able to do it. In OpenShift, for example, we have this concept of instantiate for a build config because user cannot create the pod by himself. So there's a problem of permissions that the user doesn't have to be able to create the build by himself. So we're delegating the work to the system to be able to create the build itself. With a cron job, the problem doesn't exist because a user can create manually a job out of a cron job.
So it's not a security concern per se. It wasn't clear from reading his post, but it's more that he believes it should not be a security concern.
Let me quickly pull it up because I can't remember. I was talking with him.
Is the idea that
go.
some actor sets up the cron job and then some other actor with different permissions is the one who can instantiate it, and so you have permissions to instantiate it but not mutate it?
That would be that's the build scenario.
That's the OpenShift scenario, right?
That was mentioned, and that's also what I wanted to support it with separate pod templates.
Yeah.
70.
Wait, what issue?
170.
Oh man, that's an old one.
That's the oldest one still open. So I think the main motivation in this case is to make it easier to test cron jobs without waiting for the time to elapse, and to allow things to make up for missed times and things like that.
Yeah, that was one of the reasons as well, mostly testing that the users brought up.
Okay, so but the world that we're in now is it's not practical to really have sort of sub permissions inside of a namespace. You know, it's
no, you can.
I mean, you can, but okay, that's a different discussion. SIG auth, we've been talking about that stuff, but but the whole pod template. Do we want to support that authentication issue where it's like one actor creates the cron job? Is that part of this? The goals out of this?
That's not a goal.
That's not a goal. Okay.
That's not a goal. No, the request was specifically that the user that created a cron job will be interested in instantiating it. So the problem of security does not exist. There's more of a problem that the current API server that we have does not support, because there were problems and discussions that I had with the original author about how the endpoint should work, and my general approach was that upon instantiating, it would return a job resource. but it turns out that our API server does not allow cross-version returned resources, so that a v1 beta 1 cron job instantiate cannot return a v1 job.
Well,
So,
you would have to have a way of negotiating. You'd have to have another way of negotiating the version of the thing returned, which we do actually have to deal with in cases like the scale sub-resource.
Scale sub-resource is, I think, handled differently because it installs itself in different versions. I was looking into the scale as an example where we do support it, but in case of a scale, we just install scale in different group versions. But during the processing, you're always processing a scale resource. So whatever is in is actually going out. So
we don't want to mirror the job into the same API version?
So at some point in time, we will definitely migrate cron jobs to v1, in which case the problem would not exist. But until that happens, the problem would be happening. So that means.
So what version is cron job now? I mean, there were discussions about making it v2.
V1 beta 1.
Oh, it's v1 beta 1.
Yeah, it's in beta, and I don't want to promote it further until it will be more stable. I have a few concerns with regards to the controller, how it's written. It needs to be rewritten to use the shared informers because it is not currently. And there's a few other issues that I would like to see addressed before actually promoting it further.
So do you have any, so does the cron job count the number of successes and failures or anything like that?
Yes.
Do users want or not want the test invocations to
so that would be actually, so there are two possibilities that we could handle with this. If we would use a kubectl command that could set up a annotation that would say that this cron job, this is part of a cron job, because we would be setting the owner and the references. And based on that, the cron job controller would be able to properly, I missed the word. The opposite of orphaning is adopting. So it would be able to properly adopt the job and report the status in its overall status. So, and I brought this discussion yesterday during SIG CLI meeting, and there's an agreement from the SIG CLI that we definitely need to have more kubectl create commands because we are lacking. Currently, the only way of CLI creating a job from a CLI is with kubectl run, which is kind of a complicated thing because you need to know the flag values that you need to properly pass to have the job that you care about. So we would be going towards OC create job, and that again would be further expanded with a create job from cron job, which would be then just copying the job template which is embedded in cron job, and that would get created for the user, which is a reasonable middle ground for this.
Yeah, I mean, that could be a short-term fix, but that's kind of in the opposite direction that we're intending to go with kube control. We're trying to make it thinner.
Right. That was one of the reasons that I initially started with the instantiate endpoint. But the problem is that the instantiate endpoint would be the first one of this kind, because currently the only endpoints that we have in Kube that are doing this purpose is the scale, box. I think binding and eviction are the other, but none was creating this. So there was also the discussion because fixing this endpoint or our API server so that it can actually return a different object was one approach. But with the current state of things, there are two possible approaches. Either we would be just returning a meta v1 status about that, yes, the object has been created for you and that's it, or actually creating a artificial object that will be wrapping a job inside of it. And I'm more leaning towards the former than the latter, because that the artificial object just to embed the job, it seems weird, and the user at the end of the day will end up invoking get after the job has been created.
Right. And the status is what they would get back if they. Well, what would they get back if they actually created a job? They get the job back, right?
I was thinking that we would just provide an information that this kind of the job and the namespace of the created job would be returned. That's it. I'm not sure if there's more information. I was also looking into partial object metadata, but that's not possible to be able to return. So I would probably just return metadata information inside of the status object, which seems
like as an object reference sort of
thing. Yeah, which seems reasonable given the current state of art.
Okay, and so you said you talked to SIG CLI, or you were planning to?
I did talk yesterday.
What is the next?
In 2 weeks.
And was API machinery meeting yesterday as well?
Yes.
Oh, all right. Okay, I think I'll need that explanation helped a lot. I may need some time to think about it a little bit to make a suggestion. And it seems like returning the job object is an attractive option if we can sort out the version negotiation.
Yes, that was my preferred approach from the start.
So unfortunately, I don't remember how the version negotiation for Scale works, since Scale is a different, a different API group even than the.
But Scale is the same object that you accept and return. So whatever you negotiate, you always get the same type of a Scale resource and return the same Scale resource. In this case, we negotiate a cron job instantiate, which is a cron job manual request job type of object.
But the sub resource can be a different version than the cron job. But you're saying the kind is identical as well?
Yeah, in case of a Scale, yes. You're getting and you're returning the same thing.
Okay, yeah, I'll look into it a little bit between this meeting and the community meeting.
It's definitely worth discussing and figuring out the approach, because I'm guessing that this might create a path forward for other similar sub-resource paths or stuff like that. So
yeah, and yes, I agree. Either returning a job is something that we may want to do in other cases where we want to render some derived object that has come up before, as well as actually just launching the job and returning information about that job. that is also something we have wanted previously in other cases, but hadn't implemented yet. So finding a way to do either one of those is reasonable, and the use case is very reasonable. So I'll try to think about that. I did want to get back to some of the open KEP issues before we run out of meeting time, if Phil isn't going to appear to discuss KubeBuilder.
So just real quick on the, like, why not do a client side? I know, like, there is this overall goal of slimming down kube control, but if it's a relatively straightforward operation, it doesn't seem insane to me versus creating.
I agree. That's the fallback. Like, I'd rather do that than do something we regret in the API.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it'll be much easier to deprecate the kubectl command rather than an API resource.
Yeah, the kubectl command could also be rewritten in terms of the API call, probably.
Yes, exactly. Whereas if we create an API, that will be problematic in so many ways if we decide to change it or actually fix it. Because I'm guessing the API machinery fixes will be a little bit tougher than just fixing the kubectl.
So I would say that would be the default option if we can't think of a solution we're happy with.
And I'd also say that something like run this now ends up being an edge triggered type of thing. It's similar to like reboot, which is different from scale, which is essentially sort of a accalable modify this, parent resource. The idea of like a reboot type of thing can be modeled in terms of like reboot count, or you can say like test run count. And if you increment that actually causes the test run to happen. And then you don't have a sub resource at all.
Well, if you compare this particular use case to a good old cron that we have on the Linux, then in that case, there's no manual instantiation of a job. You just copy.
I'm just saying if we have to move it server side, there's other ways to model it outside of sub resources in terms of, other ways to actually have generation counts and things like that. So modeling triggered things in a RESTful type of API is always a little bit tricky.
Making more significant changes to the cron API longer term is maybe another option as well. I know we embed pod templates and everything. We don't, in deployment, we didn't embed a replica set template very deliberately. So we could potentially, where I'm going with that is, if we had a reference to a pod template instead of a full embedded job and the small additional bit of information about the job just inlined into the cron job.
And we made a similar pivot away from volumes to PVs and PVCs, right? Because initially things.
Yeah, that's another example.
Initially it was embedded, and then we, fleshed out the scenarios and pivoted away to a richer set of primitives. Yeah.
Okay, but that's a set of things. I will think about that right after this meeting and follow up on the PR. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much.
Okay. So Phil, do you want to still talk about KubeBuilder?
Yeah, sure. Sorry about that. I'd love to. I just wanted to talk. I've been working on. I started out building something called API Server Builder about a year ago, and got some feedback on it. A number of folks have been working on it, or a number of folks have been using it for different projects. And one feedback I got was CRDs are kind of the recommended way of building things. So asking for a toolkit for building CRDs. So that's what I basically changed the code into something for supporting both CRDs and API server aggregation. And so I'm coming to SIG architecture. One question I kind of had was where this fits in best, where something like this would fit best into the project. It is a little bit of a cross-cutting piece. because it kind of touches SIG developer experience, apps, because CRDs and building controllers and that sort of piece are in SIG apps, APIs, API machinery, because it works with the informers and API server aggregation and packaging up the API machinery libraries and code generator libraries. And potentially, my hope is that it will be like a fully featured SDK that really provides end-to-end guidance for developing extensions. So that includes developing your CLI tools and documentation and all of the components that go into producing API extensions.
So I have an opinion about that, but
yeah.
Someone else was going to speak up. No. I personally think it should be API machinery. I do want to see us actually have full-fledged SDKs for both building and consuming APIs. I imagine even like the really generic parts of kube control, as we thin it down and embed less logic in kube control, would probably also migrate in that direction, especially once we broaden it out to support a lot of non-native APIs. So then kube control can kind of move up and focus on more opinionated things. But you know, if we need to eventually split out API machinery into multiple efforts, we could do that. But I think for now, API machinery is the right home for this, much like the client libraries and things like that.
Okay, awesome.
I kind of feel like working it out in a totally separate project. Like, why is it a big project?
It's a sub-project for sure. I mean, we're already.
But why wouldn't it be an associated project? I mean, this just seems like a no-brainer for something that is outside of the SIG core and outside of the SIG.
I mean, that's a good question, Phil. I mean, do you feel like this has to be sponsored by a SIG? Is there a lot of folks who want to sort of meet and sort of join in with this? I mean, there's no reason why it can't sort of exist outside of the SIG structure altogether as like an associated project with the CLA. And then, you know, if it catches fire and there's a bunch of people that want to coordinate, it might make sense to then migrate it in.
I'm concerned that we need a tight feedback loop with our extension mechanisms that we're actually currently building to make sure that they're actually built correctly.
So but I mean, the participants are going to go to API machinery.
I can't understand you at all.
It's really hard to hear you, Brennan.
Sorry, is that any better?
Yes.
A little bit.
The participants are going to go to API machinery anyway, right? So the feedback loop will be there. And honestly, in all honesty, like, I'm not super impressed with the usability that comes out of API machinery. And so I think it's actually dangerous to put it there because their focus is not on end-user usability.
Yeah, I want to echo Brendan on that. I think that the focus for API machinery is not on building stuff to be used outside of a sort of, you know, blessed few. At least not right now. I mean, that'll change over time, but
I think that's partly
it should
because,
be, but I think it's just bandwidth.
Yes, it's bandwidth and having, you know, participants who show up there who actually care about that and have time to focus on that, I think would help address that problem.
Okay, so I heard some stuff about the API machinery yesterday that it was, you know, somewhat contentious. So I think some of that is making sure that it's a welcome place that people feel like they can show up and start contributing to. I wasn't attending these. I'm waiting to see the video.
I would agree with that. Like, my experience is
Can't hear you.
Is that
Well, it sounds like something we should address regardless.
Okay, so was the takeaway there that API machinery or a separate project? I wasn't certain of that.
If it's going to go in a SIG, it should be API machinery, I think, is the takeaway. There's a question on whether it needs to be SIG associated, and I think that that's something that, you know, as the author, that's something that you can decide, Phil. I think there's some larger concerns around sort of like, is this I think we agree from the outside that this should be part of the mission for API Machinery. Whether it's actually the mission that API Machinery is taking on, I think is another open question.
It'd be a sub-project, right?
Yeah, well, but I think, again, it's like, you know, there's the meetings and there's the leadership and there's like right now that structure for doing sort of end user facing stuff is not well represented in API Machinery.
And it's
Why don't I talk with them to see if they are supportive of it then or not, and if they want it, then it can go there.
That sounds, yeah, that sounds reasonable.
Okay.
I think it's good to inject some sort of like end user sort of, you know, DNA requirements thinking into that world. So yeah, if they're amenable.
Okay, great. I know I put this on the demo slot. I wasn't certain if that was the right area when I did that. There was nothing else there. Would a demo be helpful to this group? Is anyone interested, or should I bring it over to API Machinery?
How long do you think the demo would take? 5 minutes?
I could do it in probably 5 minutes, yeah, as long as I didn't break it last night.
Or if you wanted the slot in the community meeting, would be a great place to demo too.
We're like 3 or 4 meetings out in terms of getting scheduled.
For demos in the community meeting?
Yeah, it's pretty packed. I'd say I definitely want to see a demo of this. This is a hugely important missing component in the ecosystem. So,
okay, I'll time box it to 5 minutes. I think I can get most of it. And could I share my screen in that case? It says that I can't share my screen because it's been disabled.
hang on, let me see what's going on here. That's weird.
Okay.
I'm going to make you a co-host. You can, there you go. That should allow you to do it.
All right. So you should be able to see my terminal now.
Got it.
So I'm just going to start out clean here and do an RMRF star on this directory. And so I have an empty directory, and so the first thing I want to do typically when I start a project is oops. So I have this kube builder binary here. So the first thing, you saw the error message there, and it says, hey, you got to be in, it has to be run from your Go path. So I set my Go path, and then I run the tool. And now it puts this messaging talking about different ways of running it, but the first thing it does is say, okay, like here's the typical life cycle. So run this command. So what it will do is it will go and like bootstrap a project directory for me. And this is kind of nice because like typically in Kubernetes, we put things in certain directories and the vendor needs to be at a certain place. And if you just even try getting the vendor by itself, sometimes like the Open API libraries conflict with, like not every version of every transitive library works. So this just provides a nice way of everyone's using the same version of everything so that either everyone has a bug in the library or no one does. So the next thing it says is, okay, why don't you go ahead and create a resource? And so
before you do that, can you please list the contents of the directory? Or what are you using to vendor?
Sure. Sorry, what did you say?
You're using dep.
I am using a synthetic version of dep. So what I do is I actually have a tar of all the vendor, and then I create a dep file for you. But that way you can actually just suck it down without having to like make sure that all the URLs are working and their certs are correct and all that stuff.
Do you do you lock against specific versions? That's a pain right now. So like,
Yes, I do. So what I do actually is I run dep in my tool and get the whole vendor there somewhere else, and then I tar it up with the dep files and everything else, and then give it to you. And then that way, if one of the URLs happens to be down where you pull it down, it doesn't like prevent the tool from working, which is
but it's latest stable of all the API machinery stuff that you need to pull in, because like right now the matching is like 6-0 against 1-9, and you have to match everything properly, right?
Does this answer your question? You can see
it does
here.
right there. That's what I was looking for.
Yeah, it also, I mean, it pins a lot of stuff, like this open API stuff is actually, that took me hours and hours to get all those correct over the course of breaking it multiple times over.
That's the reason why I was asking you, because I've spent those hours and hours myself.
Yeah, it's frustrating. Okay, so it prints out this command like, hey, why don't you run this next? So you go ahead and run that. And so it says, okay, I'm creating these files for you, and then I'm going to run all the code generators against your code. And at this point, I'm going to switch to what I'm sharing to my IDE, so you can actually kind of look at the code this creates. And I'm not going to go over all this stuff that it does, but just kind of give you a quick overview. Do you see that IDE? Are you able to see that?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay.
And we've got about 5 minutes.
Okay, so this really quickly, what this does is it creates the file here, the resource file with the like edit this and insert your code here. This is what was listed. It creates a test for this. So this spins up a test framework that brings up an API server locally, even on Mac or control plane, installs the CRDs, does a storage test for you, so you can add your test for validation here.
Those insert code here things is what I was looking for before, Phil, so thanks.
Yes, I added those at your feedback. Thank you for that feedback, Ryan. So again, it prints out these files when it creates them in the terminal. You may have saw that briefly. So it points, you go look at these, and then it says, edit this file. This is what created it, and here's where you edit your code. And so it has a reconcile loop for the controller. This automatically gets installed. A container can automatically be built for this and installed with all the right RBAC rules under a service account in a namespace. And then it has this init function and tells you how to watch other things. And it has a test for that controller too. And the philosophy here is really that like writing tests is really, really important, but it's kind of hard just to get right. Like how do you write a integration test for a controller that like doesn't just do polling, for instance, right? And actually uses channels to make sure things are run at the correct times and all that sort of stuff, right? And so by just providing you that test fully written and that you can run right now and it passes, and then you add your business logic to the test, like I think it's really going to help developers write tests first instead of like say, okay, that's the last thing I'm going to do after I've like done everything else. Real quickly, it provides like, it really tries to reduce friction across the whole thing. So it provides you a sample. So right off the bat, you can actually create an instance of whatever it is that you built. It makes sure that Bazel works with Gazelle, so you can have faster builds. It makes sure that docs can be built for your reference docs. There's a build docs command. It'll build all this stuff into containers, and it even builds an installer container for you over here that you can override and do different pieces with to change how things are installed. But you can flag whether you want API server aggregation or CRDs and how to install them. That's it. That's the whole thing.
Bravo.
Cool.
All right. I'm not sure, did I make the 5 minutes there?
Yeah, great.
Yeah,
we got 4 minutes. Unless there's something else, there is something at the end of the agenda here about close state on the KEPs, but I feel like that's a foolish errand. So let's table that for next meeting and go ahead and adjourn with 2 minutes to spare.
Well, I actually think there was one relatively simple issue, which is just the draft versus accepted versus provisional versus some other thing. I think the biggest challenge with the KEP so far, I mean, we've actually proposed several different ways of dealing with the initial formulation of the KEP. All of them are kind of going, all the things that we wanted to try are kind of going against the grain for natural tendencies of people on this project to bike shed for, and, you know, have productive, constructive debate as well for a really long time. but one of the goals was to find a way to facilitate forward progress. So I don't know how to solve that problem yet. I don't have any new ideas that we haven't discussed before. But were there objections to using the term provisional, or any other better or other suggestions?
What was the argument against draft?
My argument against draft was that we have used it a lot in the past, and it became meaningless because people would go ahead, things would stay in draft forever, and they would be abandoned and they would stay in draft, or they would be implemented and stay in draft, or they would be improved and stay in draft. So like draft has, to me, no longer has any meaning, and it doesn't really suggest where it is in the process or that it has later. Like if something is approved but not implemented and it might still change, is that still draft? Like to me, it's not suggestive of anything anymore. And I don't know if that's true for other people, but I just don't find it useful as a state in terms of the process. And I'm not totally opposed to it if people don't like provisional or anything else.
I'm cool with provisional. I think the biggest thing is we just got to change behavior, and people don't read the process. We're trying to get people to sort of like check stuff in earlier and sort of try and keep these PRs tractable.
Yeah, and I know Caleb wanted people to just have people check in the parts that are agreed upon, but I mean that is also a pretty big change in behavior, because like I don't people would put in a lot of text and then they would be asked to remove most of it to get down to something that could be agreed upon, and then they would have to create a new PR that added it back. I'm not opposed to trying that, but it is a pretty even more significant change in behavior, I think.
My only comment for something other than provisional was my reading of the is that draft to me, or provisional to me, even sounds like I'm just writing a document. There seems to need to be a step where a SIG owns this and has accepted that they're going to own it. So I was implying there could be other words like owned or accept.
Accepted is the word
I think
we had.
The fact that the SIG has taken up that work is kind of implied by just having a SIG thing there. I think we're focused on sort of which SIG does this belong to, but I mean, especially for the ones that aren't sitting at the root that are in a SIG directory, there's sort of an implied like, hey, if that thing gets merged at all, that SIG has taken up that work, right? So I think that sort of accepted by the SIG is kind of implied.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep, no need to bike shed further.
All right, everybody. Thank you so much.
So let's continue in that issue and
right?
try and see if we can come to some closure there. Sorry, Jason.
Yeah.
Want to wrap it up.
Yeah, no, provisional seems like there's just enough agreement to move forward. I agree with the logic around draft. It's meaningless. So, all right, everybody. Thank you again for a great meeting, and I'll see you in a week.
Okay, great.